What is up, guys? Today we're going to be learning about Class 11 Legal Studies Chapter 1, Concept of State. This is the Part 2 lecture to this chapter, so if you haven't already, please watch the Part 1 video, as this is a continuation. Today we're going to be discussing the topic, Emergence of State from Society. Now, we know that a state has four elements: population, territory, government, and sovereignty, right? State is often referred to as society which is politically organized. We can say that this phrase is a correct definition for a state, as the word society, as we know, refers to the population of the territory where society actually exists, and the word politically organized refers to the government which has sovereign power, right? So when we consider state as a society politically organized, a thought arises, which is, how does a state emerge from a society? Or how does a society establish the idea of a state, right? So, a society has people. A society is basically an association of people who live a collective life together. And people, they form social relations with one another to fulfill their needs. What kind of needs? We form social relations in society to fulfill our needs of emotional needs, spiritual needs, and intellectual needs. For example, if we ever aren't feeling well and we're just not emotionally stable, we often like to confide in a friend or any other person. And we fulfill our emotional need to make ourselves happy. Our spiritual need, whenever we want any religious guidance, we look up to someone. For intellectual needs, we often go to some older, wiser person, and we form a social relation with them for our own intellectual needs to gain knowledge. A society also has institutions, which is a fact that cannot be denied, as mentioned in the textbook. What are societal institutions? Well, they're basically organizations which establish social norms, such as a family, schools, tribes, clans, temples. These are all social institutions, and social relations are formed within these institutions. As in these institutions, we meet other people and we form social relations with them. But we don't form social relations with everyone. As human beings, we tend to only form social relations with a few select people on the basis of various things, right? So if we want to go in depth in social relationships, we have to understand the basis in which we form social relationships and how social relationships are governed. We form social relationships on the basis of our affinity towards them, or how close we are with them, or how similar we are with them. If we form a relation with someone in society, it's mainly due to our commonality in language, in our background, in our caste, etc. Social relationships are governed through contracts, through moral understanding, etc. Right? So I just want to give you guys a brief of the elements in society, so we can really understand how society leads to the existence and emergence of a state. Okay, so society. We want to maintain social order in society. That's a perpetual task of people in society. We want to maintain social order. What is social order? It's basically beliefs and standards that enable stability in society. What kind of beliefs and standards? Like equality amongst all, or culture and tradition, or hierarchies. These are all things in society. These are beliefs, norms, and standards in society. And in order to maintain them, in order to make sure they don't collapse or go in vain, we tend to create common laws and we obey a supreme authority to make sure these beliefs and standards are upheld. And thus, to maintain social order, we create these laws and we obey a supreme authority. And thus, when we do these two things, we create a government and we create sovereignty within ourselves, and that's how a state is formed in society. Another reason how society leads to the existence of state is that in society, we want a purpose. As Aristotle mentioned, man is a social animal, man is a political animal. It is a tendency of humans to create a political system to give a purpose in our lives, to give a purpose in society. So that's how state is emerged from society, right? This is another statement. Society creates a state, but a state does not create a society. It means the existence of a state depends on society. but the existence of society doesn't depend on state. Basically, state always comes after society in terms of existence. State cannot directly create a society. To understand this, we'll look into the work of a political thinker and philosopher, MacIver, as he wrote in his book, The Modern State. Elements in society, such as social forms, like the family and church, social forces, or things that can lead to influence or change, like tradition and competition, social motives, like friendship and jealousy, all these parts of society, they cannot be created by the state. State has no role in creating these elements of society. These elements of society come naturally. But in society, the people amongst themselves create an organization and political institution like the state. Hope this is understood. Now let's go on to the definition of state according to J.W. Garner. So we already learned about the definition of state according to Black's Law Dictionary. We also learned about the definition of state as a society politically organized through its 4 elements. But let's look at the definition of state according to another lawyer, J.W. Garner. So, state is a community of persons, more or less numerous permanently. So, this covers the first element of state, population. It occupying a definite portion of territory. This comes under territory. Independent or nearly so of external control or possessing. This refers to sovereign power. An organized government to which the great body of inhabitants render habitual obedience. So, government. In this definition by J.W. Garner, all 4 elements of state are covered, which is an easy way to remember this definition. So now let's move on to the topic, theories on the origin of state. So various political thinkers and philosophers have propounded theories which explain how the state has come into existence. There are 5 theories, and these 5 theories can majorly be classified by theories on the basis of family, theories on the basis of religion, theories on the basis of social contract, which inevitably led to the origin of state. So on the basis of family, there are 3 theories that we're going to be studying. 1, the theory of kinship, and 2, the theory of patriarchy, the patriarchal theory, and 3, the matriarchal theory. On the basis of religion, we have the divine theory, which suggests that religion led to the origin of state. And on the basis of social contract, the social contract theory was propounded by 3 philosophers, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who had conflicting opinions on the theory, but all of them majorly state how social contract led to the origin of state. So I'll be going in depth on them, but the way I'm going to be explaining each theory is going to be simple and as easy to understand as possible. So in the exam, if they ever ask you to write a short note on X theory, for example, the patriarchy theory, what the examiner is looking for as the answer is going to majorly be the philosophers' names, the brief explanation of a theory, and examples, if any, right? The textbook has given us an entire paragraph for each theory, but it's not necessary to learn all of that. We can simply just remember them through the names of the political thinkers who have propounded the theory, and just a brief explanation with a few keywords and key phrases and examples. That's it. This will make it easy for you guys to remember, and you guys can note this down. It'll be really useful for exams, and yeah, I don't want to overcomplicate the theories as it's mentioned in the textbook. I'll make this as easy to understand as possible, right? So first, theory of kinship. The philosophers who propounded this theory, Aristotle and MacIver, right? The one-line explanation for this theory is basically that family led to the creation of society. First of all, theory of kinship. What does kinship mean? Kinship is another word for family, for blood relations, right? So in a typical village, right, we have a group of people and they are more likely descendants of one common ancestor, right? One common ancestor who was the first to come to that village. They started a family, and everyone in the village most likely are descendants of that common ancestor, right? And that's how this one family, they take the name of the common ancestor as a symbol of kinship, and they keep it as a surname or whatever, right? And this family, it inevitably leads to tribes and clans, and the entire village itself. They take their common ancestor as a symbol of kinship. And as more and more social groups and more people get connected through the symbol of kinship, that leads to the origin of a state. Also, the theory of kinship states that in a family, obedience, command, and discipline towards the eldest person is maintained. And this is reflected through the way that we have obedience, command, and discipline towards the sovereign power. So that's how family itself led to the creation of sovereignty and thus the origin of state. And also how the tribes and clans and villages that are formed through the connection of families led to a government being formed to administer the people and thus the origin of a state through kinship. So now let's discuss the patriarchal theory. The philosophers who propounded this theory, there's only one, namely Henry Maine. Now let's learn about the patriarchal theory. The philosopher who propounded this theory was Henry Maine, as mentioned in his book, The Spirit of Laws. The one-liner explanation for this theory is that male domination led to the creation of a state. So the patriarchal theory is based on the kinship theory. However, it stresses that the eldest male descendant had autocracy and authority over the family, as it was a patriarchal society and obviously the men had more domination. This autocracy and authority over his family members led to obedience and command to a sovereign control and power, which has basis Now let's learn about the patriarchal theory. The philosopher who propounded this theory was Henry Maine, as mentioned in his book, The Spirit of Laws. The one-liner explanation for this theory is that male domination led to the creation of a state. So the patriarchal theory was similar and based on the theory of kinship. However, it stressed that the eldest male descendant had autocracy and authority over the family, as it was a male-dominated society back then, which is why that led to the origin of a state, as it created obedience and command over the sovereign control, which in this case is the eldest male descendant. Also, the eldest male descendant expanded family through polygamy. We know that polygamy is a system where one man can have more than one wife. And obviously this expansion of family led to tribes and clans, and thus led to the creation of a state. Now let's move on to the matriarchal theory, which is the same as the patriarchal theory. However, we know that matriarchy is a system where women have domination over society. The philosophers who propounded this theory were Edward Jenks and McLennan, and thus this theory explains that female domination led to the creation of a state. So it's the same thing. The eldest female descendant had autocracy and authority over the family, and the female expanded family through polyandry. And polyandry is the opposite of polygamy. It states that one woman can have more than one husband, which obviously expanded the family and created the origin of a state. Examples of the matriarchal theory is in the primitive Australian totem tribes, where matriarchy existed and it led to the origin of a state. Also the Minangkabau tribe in Indonesia. The divine theory. The philosophers for the divine theory were James I and Robert Filmer, and it basically states that the state is established by God, right? So the people who believe in the divine theory state that God created everything, every institution, every living creature, and God sends incarnations or imposters, impersonifications of God itself, such as a king. And people tend to obey the king by believing that he is an incarnation of God. Usually, by laws backed by religious sanction, they obey this ruler in the fear of God, right? And many religions believe in this theory. For example, the Hindus believe that Lord Rama was incarnation of God, which led to the state and the kingdom, right? And the Muslims, according to Islam religion, even Allah was an incarnation of God. And due to the laws backed up by religious sanctions and religious customs, the people believe that the king or ruler is an incarnation of God, and they obey them, and they believe in the supreme authority of the ruler in fear of God due to the religious sanctions and just the basis of religion. And thus, it created an established political authority through God, and that's what led to the origin of a state. Next, we'll learn about the social contract theory. So the three philosophers who propounded this theory: Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau. So the explanation. The social contract theory states that before we had this political system or any political institution such as the state, humans, we were in a state of nature. There was just so much chaos. Humans were always trying to kill one another, or in some cases, they just didn't have any uniform laws. There's different interpretations of this. And through mutual agreement and consent, as the social contract theory states, it led to the formation of a state. Mutual agreement and mutual consent to live with one another peacefully. That's what led to the origin of a state. So according to Thomas Hobbes, and as I mentioned, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, they all had conflicting opinions on the theory of social contract, but the base is still the same. According to Thomas Hobbes, according to him, the state of nature, or the pre-political nature of humans, was that human beings would always kill one another. We were vicious, we were cruel to one another, and to protect ourselves and secure human rights, the people back then, they formed a social contract amongst each other to live in peace. And this was governed through a ruler, or a sovereign power, and thus we became subject to the ruler, as the social contract to live peacefully amongst ourselves was governed by that ruler, and so obviously we surrendered our rights to that ruler. Next, according to John Locke, according to him, the pre-political nature of humans, or the state of nature, was that people weren't violent, but they had their own interpretation of laws, right? One person would say something else, other would say something else. There was no uniform laws. There was no common laws. And to enforce them uniformly, we formed a government with a system of law and justice where laws would be enforced the same to all people. Thus, with mutual agreement and mutual consent, a social contract was formed, and this led to the origin and existence of the state. According to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the general will of the people, so the people themselves, they collectively decided to have mutual agreement and consent because they wanted to form equality and liberty amongst each other without obeying any supreme order. So Jean-Jacques Rousseau, he directly stated that social contract theory was responsible for creating direct democracies. We know what democracy is. A direct democracy is one where we don't elect people, but every single person themselves, they vote for any law or policy, etc. We don't see an indirect democracy is the one we're living in right now, where we elect some MLA or MP to represent our wishes in the parliament, but we technically don't have any say. But according to Jean-Jacques Rousseau, the general will of the people was to form a social contract and form a direct democracy through mutual agreement and consent. And now let's talk about the elements of the state. So we already know what the elements are, and we're basically going to go simply what the textbook has given, which talks about what some political thinkers had a say on each of the elements of the state, and any examples of the elements of a state. For example, one of the elements of a state, as we know, is population. We'll learn about which country or which state has the highest population, lowest population, just because mentioned, and we don't want to leave this concept, right? It's pretty simple. We'll just quickly get on with this. So for elements of state, population. Population is an element of the state, as we know. There cannot be a state without people to actually be governed by, right? Plato, Aristotle, and Leacock were the ones who had their say upon population of a state and their ideas on it. According to Plato, an ideal state should have at least 5,040 citizens. It is unclear how he got to this precise number. Aristotle stated that the population of a state shouldn't be too large as it would lead to inconvenient administration, but it shouldn't be too small as there would be no security. because there would be any people to protect ourselves. According to Leacock, the number of citizens must align with the space and the resources. So if there's limited space, limited resources, we shouldn't have a high population as it'd be difficult to run the state. Right, now let's look into examples. So for population, we have heterogeneous population and homogeneous population. Heterogeneous means that in the population there are people of different races. Not everyone is the same, right? Homogeneous population is where people are more or less the same race, same background, they are alike and similar in many ways. There's not much diversity, unlike heterogeneous. Example of countries or states with heterogeneous population: USA and India. There's much diversity and not everyone is alike. However, China has homogeneous population, as almost 99% of the population are Chinese, and they obviously have the same race, same color, same background, etc. Also, the state with the highest population is China with 1.4 billion, whereas Vatican City is the state with the smallest population, with less than 821 citizens, I believe. Now, territory. The philosophers who had a say on territory of a state were Aristotle and Montesquieu. Aristotle stated that the territory should be of Montesquieu stated that the size of the territory is connected with the form of the government. For example, if there's a large territory, then obviously we have to administer it. It'll be pretty difficult to have one ruler entire territory. So in that case, there should be a democratic government so that every single small district have their own say. There should also be local government for a large territory. If it's a smaller territory, it might be convenient to have autocracy. So examples of states with the large and small amount of territory. Russia has the largest amount of territory in the world, whereas the Vatican City has the smallest territory with less than 50 square kilometers. Government. So we know what government is. It's a political institution with three organs: legislature, executive, and judiciary. And the government is in charge of maintaining law and order and ensuring peace, security, and fulfilling the wishes of the people through making laws and policies. Now, sovereignty. Sovereignty is often characterized as the most important element of a state, because without sovereignty, without a supreme power or authority, the existence of a state simply wouldn't be there. Sovereignty can be classified into two types: internal sovereignty and external sovereignty. Internal sovereignty is within the people itself. When the people itself has sovereign and supreme power and authority and they are surrendered to it, then that is called internal sovereignty. External sovereignty is where there is no influence by any external country or authority. For example, the power exercised by India isn't influenced by the UN or any other country. That's about it. Hope you guys enjoyed the video on Chapter 1, Concept of State.